The rain fell in soft sheets over Rue de Martyr, blurring the edges of the narrow Parisian street like a watercolor painting left to run. Through the fogged glass of the boulangerie window, the world outside shimmered. Umbrellas bobbing past, a dog trotting quickly on soaked cobblestones, pedestrians hurrying to escape the chill. Inside, the warm glow of the bakery was a sanctuary from the gray drizzle. Golden light spilled across rustic wooden tables, illuminating the white flour dust that hung in the air like whispered promises. Sophie sat alone at her usual spot, a small table pressed against the window. The red scarf wrapped loosely around her neck was a burst of color against her muted gray coat, a silent flare of defiance, or perhaps a signal of something still burning beneath her calm exterior. Her hands cradled a delicate china cup filled with fragrant tea, steam curling upward in languid spirals. Beside it, a warm croissant rested on a simple porcelain plate, its flaky layers glistening with buttery sheen. Her eyes, dark and reflective, were fixed on the street beyond, but her gaze was distant, tethered not to the rain but to something unseen, something aching quietly within. Then, as if she could no longer hold it back, the faintest tremor shook her body, and a single tear escaped down her cheek. She wiped it quickly, cheeks flushed, breath catching in the silence of the morning rush. The other customers were engrossed in their own routines, the hurried exchanges of neighbors, the soft laughter of a couple sharing pastries. But Sophie was an island, quietly unraveling in plain sight. Behind the counter, Julien watched her with a quiet attentiveness that went unnoticed. His hands, roughened by years of kneading dough, rested lightly on the polished wood as he paused in his tasks. The scent of freshly baked baguettes mingled with the sharp tang of yeast and caramelized sugar from the tarts cooling on the shelves. Julien's eyes, deep and steady, softened as they traced the tremble of Sophie's frame. She came every Thursday, almost like clockwork, ordering the same things, sitting in the same chair, and always, always carrying that weight that seemed to press down on her like the Parisian rain outside. He knew something was hidden beneath the quiet sorrow she bore, a story woven in shadows and silences, a heart that had been bruised but refused to break completely. Julien's own past was etched in the gentle lines of his face, a widower who understood loss as intimately as he did the rhythm of bread rising. But he said nothing. Instead, he busied himself behind the counter, folding the dough for the day's pastries, all the while watching her as if his presence might be an unspoken balm. Sophie's breath fogged the window, and she pressed a palm against the glass, tracing the outline of a raindrop, as if it could lead her somewhere beyond the melancholy. The boulangerie's bell tinkled softly as another customer entered, drawing her back from the brink. She straightened, masking the quiet breakdown with a forced composure. Julien caught the fleeting vulnerability in her eyes and offered a small, understanding nod, a silent promise that she was seen. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion on the city. Inside, amid the scent of butter and yeast, a fragile moment settled between two solitary souls, unspoken but deeply felt. Sophie only cried at the boulangerie, and Julien would be there, quietly witnessing the woman with the red scarf unraveling one tear at a time. The next Thursday dawned crisp and clear, with sunlight cutting through the remnants of early morning mist that clung stubbornly to the corners of Paris's narrow streets. Sophie hesitated only a moment before stepping into the boulangerie, the familiar warmth enveloping her like a fragile embrace. The buttery scent of pastries mingled with the rich aroma of roasting coffee beans, a sensory balm that softened the edges of her guarded heart. Behind the counter, Julien's hands moved deftly, shaping dough with the quiet precision of a craftsman. But it wasn't Julien alone who caught Sophie's eye today. Near the window, tucked into a high wooden chair, was a small girl with a cascade of dark curls, intensely focused on the sketch pad resting on her knees. Her pencil moved swiftly, the tip dancing across the page in confident, fluid strokes. Eloise's brow furrowed in concentration, oblivious to the bustle around her. Sophie took her usual seat by the window, the red scarf still wrapped snugly around her neck. A shield she wore as much for comfort as for color. She ordered the familiar croissant and tea, her voice barely above a whisper. But before she could retreat into silence, the girl looked up from her drawing and caught Sophie's gaze. Joli foulard, Eloise said, her voice light and clear, a simple compliment that felt like a sudden spark in the quiet bakery. Sophie blinked, caught off guard. She managed a small, hesitant smile. Merci, she replied softly, her eyes meeting the child's with an unfamiliar warmth. Eloise slid down from her chair and crossed the room with the unself-conscious ease of a child. She held out the sketch pad, revealing a delicate charcoal drawing of the boulangerie's storefront, the letters of the sign carefully traced, and a bright splash of color where she'd captured the red of Sophie's scarf. I like to draw what I see, Eloise explained simply. You come here every week with your scarf. I thought you might like to see. Sophie's heart, so often wrapped in silence, stirred. She glanced toward Julien, who was watching the exchange from behind the counter. His expression was unreadable but attentive, a quiet invitation to let down her walls. The familiarity of the scene, the soft footsteps of a child, the warmth of freshly baked bread, the delicate trust in a stranger's gift tugged at something Sophie had long buried. Her instinct was to retreat, to keep the fragile distance that had protected her for so long. But Eloise's openness was disarming. The girl's wide eyes held no judgment, only the pure curiosity and kindness that children so naturally offer. Sophie reached out, touching the sketch pad gently. The charcoal smudged slightly under her fingers, the image imperfect but real, an honest reflection of a place that had become a sanctuary in more ways than one. C'est très beau, Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Eloise grinned, a lightness bubbling in her expression. You smile now? That's new. A flush rose in Sophie's cheeks, half embarrassment, half something warmer, hope, perhaps. It was the first time anyone had noticed the small flickers of change within her, the gentle thawing beneath the red scarf. Julien approached, clearing a spot on the counter. Your friend here is quite the artist, he said with a soft smile. Sophie looked up into his steady gaze and felt the faintest shift, a thread of connection weaving silently between them. The boulangerie, with its scents and light and quiet corners, was becoming more than a refuge. It was becoming a place where the heart might begin to open again. Outside, Paris pulsed with life, unaware, as always, of the small, tender moments unfolding within its streets. And inside, Sophie let herself smile, fragile and new, the weight of loneliness easing just enough to breathe. The boulangerie was quiet now, the midday rush having long passed, leaving behind only the lingering aroma of baked bread and melting butter. Outside, the Parisian streets hummed softly with distant footsteps and murmured conversations, but inside, the world had slowed to a near stillness. Sophie lingered by the counter, hesitating as if caught between retreat and connection. Julien stood behind the wood-worn bar, the flour on his apron faintly dusted by the afternoon light. His eyes, usually so calm and steady, held a gentle concern as he cleared a space on the counter to rest his hands. Vous allez bien? His voice was low, careful, a question that carried no expectation, only quiet invitation. Sophie blinked, startled by the directness of the inquiry. She had no practiced answer, no rehearsed words to shield the fragile truth beneath her composure. Instead, she let silence hover, heavy yet honest. Julien waited patiently, his gaze softening. Sometimes, he said quietly, just saying it aloud helps, even if it's only a little. Her thoughts drifted, unbidden and relentless, into the shadows of her past. She saw again the small apartment she had left behind, bare walls echoing with absence, the ghostly silence after the last box was packed. The photographs scattered across the floor, a wedding day frozen in time, smiles now faded, promises unraveling like old thread. She remembered the night spent staring at a ceiling that offered no comfort, the sharp words exchanged in anger and disappointment, the slow, suffocating unraveling of love. A flash of a recent conversation with her sister floated to the surface, Claire's voice warm yet insistent over the crackling phone line. Tu dois recommencer, Sophie. Pas pour lui, pour toi. Va vivre, respire, aime à nouveau. Ne reste pas là, dans cette cage de souvenirs. The memory stung, a tender wound that no amount of silence could hide. Sophie swallowed hard, the lump in her throat refusing to dissolve. She looked up at Julien, who watched her with the quiet understanding of someone who had loved and lost in his own way. I'm managing, she said finally, voice soft and unsteady. Some days better than others. Julien nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting in a faint, compassionate smile. It's okay to not be okay. We all carry things like that. Sometimes the weight is too much to bear alone. The words, simple and unadorned, wrapped around Sophie like a fragile thread of comfort. She wanted to speak more, to unravel the tangled knot of grief and fear inside her, but the courage was not yet there. Instead, she let the quiet settle between them, a shared space of understanding without pressure. Julien reached beneath the counter and produced a small paper bag, carefully folded at the top. "For you," he said, sliding it across the polished wood. "A fresh pain au chocolat, on the house." Sophie hesitated, then accepted the gift, the warm, flaky pastry still faintly steaming inside the paper. It was a small gesture, but in it she felt a promise, not of easy healing or swift happiness, but of gentle patience and kindness. She offered a tentative smile, the first genuine curve of her lips in days, maybe weeks. The boulangerie, with its scent of butter and yeast and quiet humanity, had become a place where silence could speak, where brokenness might find a sliver of grace. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets glistening under a shy sun. Inside, two solitary souls shared a fragile moment, unfinished, uncertain, but undeniably real. And in that space, Sophie allowed herself, just for a moment, to hope. The streets outside had emptied into soft shadows as Sophie pushed open the boulangerie's door well past its usual morning bustle. The bell above tinkled softly, a fragile sound that seemed to echo in the stillness. Inside, the fading daylight filtered through the lace curtains, casting dappled patterns on the worn wooden floor. The scent of flour and warm ovens lingered like a gentle embrace, wrapping around her as if the bakery itself were holding its breath. Julien was at the far end of the counter, wiping down surfaces with methodical care. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms dusted with flour, and the quiet steadiness in his eyes softened as he glanced up. "Bonsoir, Sophie. You're late today." She offered a small, tired smile and hesitated, the familiar weight settling in her chest. "I lost track of time." He nodded without pressing, setting aside the cloth. "Would you like some coffee? I'm just finishing up." Surprise flickered in her eyes, a silent invitation she didn't quite expect, but quietly welcomed. She nodded, moving to the small table by the window, the same one where she had first let her tears fall weeks ago. Julien brought over two steaming cups, the dark liquid swirling gently beneath a thin veil of foam. They settled into a comfortable silence, broken only by the faint tick of the old wall clock and the distant hum of the city settling into night. Sophie took a tentative sip, savoring the bitterness that cut through the lingering heaviness inside her. She glanced at Julien, wondering how to bridge the distance that had, until now, been guarded by unspoken sorrows. He spoke first, his voice low and roughened by years of wear. "I lost her 5 years ago. One day she was there, and the next—" His words drifted off, unfinished, like a sentence caught in the wind. Sophie's eyes softened. "I think I understand that feeling. Not the loss of a person, but the loss of who I was. After the divorce, I hardly recognized myself anymore." Julien nodded slowly, his gaze steady and patient. "Life has a way of shifting beneath us, doesn't it? Leaving us to find new footing on unfamiliar ground." She swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "There were days I barely left the apartment. I felt invisible, like a ghost haunting my own life." "Loneliness is its own kind of shadow," Julien said gently. "But sometimes, in the quiet, you find something you thought was lost, or maybe something new entirely." A fragile pause stretched between them, filled with the soft sounds of the boulangerie settling into rest. Sophie's breath hitched unexpectedly, and then, almost before she realized it, a soft laugh escaped her lips, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in months. It was tentative, delicate, like a fragile bud daring to bloom in the frost. Julien looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes, quickly replaced by a warm smile. "That sounds like progress." Sophie smiled back, a spark of light kindling deep within. For the first time since she had taken refuge in this bakery, she felt the stirrings of something she had forgotten, the possibility of joy, however small, however fleeting. Outside, the Parisian night deepened, but inside the boulangerie, two solitary souls sat quietly, finding in the fading light a shared space where healing might begin. The following Thursday arrived without the usual pull of the boulangerie's warm glow. Sophie stood by her window at home, the soft Parisian morning light slipping through lace curtains, yet her heart felt heavy and uncertain. The red scarf that had become her signature comfort lay folded on a chair, untouched. She had planned to visit Julienne and Eloise as always, but found herself hesitating, caught in a whirlwind of questions and quiet fears. Was she moving too quickly? Was this fragile connection something real, or merely a balm to mask the ache? The thought unsettled her, and so she stayed away. Inside the boulangerie, Julien noticed immediately. Thursday mornings without Sophie's silent presence by the window felt empty, like a page missing from a familiar book. He wiped down the counter again, his eyes lingering toward the door. Eloise, perched nearby with her sketchpad, looked up from her drawing. "Papa," she said softly, "why hasn't Madame Sophie come today? She always comes." Julien's smile was slow, touched with a hint of worry. Sometimes people need time to find their way back to us. Eloise's lips pressed into a small, thoughtful line. "I hope she comes back soon. I want to show her my new drawing." Meanwhile, Sophie wandered the winding streets of the 11th arrondissement, thoughts tangled like the bare branches overhead. Suddenly, near a cafe she used to frequent, a familiar voice stopped her cold. "Sophie." She turned to see her ex-husband, Mark, his face a mix of surprise and something unreadable, regret, perhaps, or frustration. "I didn't expect to see you here," Sophie said, steadying her breath. Mark hesitated, then stepped closer. "I heard about your visits to the boulangerie. Julien's place, right?" A flicker of anger sparked in Sophie's chest. "What do you want, Mark?" "To talk," he said quietly. "Maybe to understand what went wrong." Their conversation spiraled quickly into the jagged terrain of old wounds, words that once were whispered, now sharp and raw. Sophie's voice trembled with the weight of years spent in silence. "You never listened. You left me alone in that apartment with nothing but memories that suffocated." Mark's eyes darkened. "And you shut me out before I even tried." The argument ended without resolution, the space between them filled with the ghosts of broken promises and lost love. Sophie walked away, her heart pounding, a mixture of relief and devastation swirling within her. As the afternoon sun dipped low, she found herself walking back toward the boulangerie, her steps slow and hesitant. The familiar bell tinkled faintly in the distance, a siren call to the place where she had both found refuge and begun to heal. But as she stood before the door, the red scarf still folded in her bag, Sophie paused. The fear of opening old wounds, the uncertainty of new beginnings, pressed down on her like the lingering chill in the air. She took a breath, the city's heartbeat pulsing all around her, and wondered, would she step inside again? Or would the crumbs of doubt keep her on the threshold, watching from afar? The rain had returned to Paris with a steady, rhythmic pulse, drumming softly against the cobblestones and gathering in small pools along the edges of the sidewalks. Sophie stood just outside the boulangerie's door, the red scarf now wrapped tightly around her neck, but her fingers clenched the fabric as if trying to hold herself together against the chill, not just from the weather, but from the storm inside her. Her breath formed little clouds in the cold air as she hesitated, every step away from the doorway feeling heavier than the last. Just as she was about to turn and vanish into the gray drizzle, the wooden door swung open quietly. Julien's familiar, calm presence filled the threshold. His eyes, deep pools of kindness, met hers with no trace of judgment. "Sophie," he said softly, "come in. No one else is here." Relief, raw and immediate, washed over her, and she stepped inside. The warmth of the boulangerie wrapped around her like a gentle embrace, the scent of yeast and warm butter filling the air. Outside, the rain tapped insistently against the windows, a soft soundtrack to the quiet intimacy unfolding within. They settled near the counter, the fading daylight casting long shadows across the tiles. Julien poured 2 cups of coffee without a word, the steam curling upward like fragile whispers. Sophie's voice trembled as she finally broke the silence. "There was a moment," she began, "when I looked in the mirror one morning and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Not because of how I looked, but because she was someone I didn't know anymore, hollowed out by years of silence and distance." Julien nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "Grief does that," he said. "When I lost her, my wife, it was like the ground beneath me disappeared. I was afraid to connect again, afraid that opening my heart would only bring more pain. She looked at him, vulnerability unmasked for the first time. I'm scared too, she whispered. Scared that if I let myself hope, I'll just lose everything all over again. Julien reached out, his hand hovering near hers, a question without words. For a moment, the space between them seemed charged, a quiet electricity humming in the air. Their faces edged closer, breaths mingling in the soft glow of the bakery's fading light. But the moment held, delicate and unbroken, and then gently, Julien pulled back, his eyes still locked on hers. "Whenever you're ready," he said, his voice barely above a breath. Sophie's fingers found his hand, tracing the lines with a tenderness that spoke louder than any words. She squeezed once, softly, then released, standing slowly. The rain continued its steady rhythm outside as Sophie slipped her scarf tighter and moved toward the door, leaving behind the warmth of the boulangerie, but carrying with her a fragile thread of hope. Julien watched her go, the echo of their near touch lingering in the quiet air, a promise waiting patiently to be fulfilled. The soft glow of dawn spilled over Paris as Sophie approached the boulangerie. A steady calm settled deep within her. The air was crisp but not biting, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and freshly baked bread. Wrapped loosely around her shoulders was the red scarf, but this morning it felt different, less like a shield and more like a quiet companion. In her hands, she carried a small, carefully wrapped package, a colorful children's art book, its pages promising worlds of imagination and color, meant for Eloise. The bell tinkled above the door, announcing her arrival, but Sophie's face bore no trace of the tear-streaked vulnerability that had accompanied her for so many Thursdays. Instead, a gentle smile warmed her lips, hesitant yet sincere. Julien looked up from behind the counter, surprise flickering in his steady eyes. "Sophie," he greeted, voice soft but brightening. "You're early." "I thought Eloise might like this," Sophie said, extending the gift. "She draws so beautifully." Julien's expression softened as he accepted the book, the corners of his mouth lifting in genuine gratitude. "She'll love it. Thank you." Eloise appeared moments later, her face lighting up when she saw the book. She reached out eagerly, flipping through the pages with wide-eyed wonder. "Merci, Sophie. Look, there's a page just for me to fill." Laughter spilled naturally between them, light and unforced, weaving a new thread of warmth through the boulangerie. The regulars noticed too. Madame Moreau smiled knowingly as she sipped her espresso. Monsieur Lambert nodded approvingly from his corner seat. The bakery felt alive in a way it hadn't before, a place where friendship was no longer tentative but blossoming quietly. Sophie settled into her usual spot by the window, but this time her eyes shimmered with a steady light. She listened as Julien shared a story about a childhood baking mishap, the way flour had exploded like a cloud, coating everyone in white. She laughed, a clear sound that surprised her with its ease. A sudden flashback swept through her mind, an afternoon months ago, in a cramped apartment bathed in harsh fluorescent light. Sophie had stood trembling, her hands clenched, tears flooding freely as anger and heartbreak erupted uncontrollably. The rawness of that moment had seemed endless, suffocating. But here now, beneath the golden bakery light and among the scent of fresh bread, she felt the soft counterpoint of that pain, calmness. A new beginning built not on forgetting, but on gentle acceptance. Julien wiped his hands on his apron and glanced at Sophie with a shy smile. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a crumpled napkin and with a small flourish, slid it across the table toward her. Sophie picked it up carefully, unfolding the paper to reveal Julien's phone number scrawled in neat, deliberate handwriting. For the first time in a long while, her heart skipped, quietly, tenderly, as a new chapter whispered open before her. The boulangerie was alive with the morning rush, doors opening and closing like the beat of a restless heart, the air thick with the scent of yeast and sugar, the chatter of neighbors blending with the clatter of trays and cups. Sophie arrived early, the pale light just beginning to filter through the windows, casting soft shadows across the wooden counters and well-worn shelves. Today felt different, not just because she was here before most, but because the walls seemed to hum with possibility. Julien greeted her with a tired smile, flour dusting his dark hair like a gentle frost. Ready to get your hands dirty? He teased, pulling on a flower-streaked apron and beckoning her to the kneading table. Sophie laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar yet freeing. She rolled up her sleeves and joined him, the cool dough squishing between her fingers as Julienne demonstrated the rhythm: push, fold, turn. Their hands moved in tandem, the tactile intimacy of shared labor drawing them closer in ways neither dared speak aloud. Like this, Julien murmured, his breath warm against her ear. Feel the dough respond. It's alive. Just like us. A soft laugh broke the quiet as Eloise burst through the door, cheeks flushed from the cool morning air. Her eyes lit up when she saw Sophie. You look like Mama when she used to laugh, she said simply, her voice innocent but piercing. The room fell still, the words hanging between the adults like fragile glass. Julian's face paled, a shadow crossing his expression. Sophie's breath caught, her heart pounding in sudden silence. Julian swallowed, then spoke, voice low and raw. I'm afraid, he confessed, eyes searching hers. Afraid that moving on means forgetting or losing her all over again. Sophie's fingers trembled as she wiped flour from her hands. And I'm tired, she whispered. Tired of standing still, afraid to risk falling. Their gazes locked, the unspoken longing and fear mingling in the warm, flour-dusted air. Slowly, Julian reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from Sophie's face. The world narrowed to the space between them, the soft rise and fall of their breaths, the quiet pulse of hearts daring to hope. Then, tentative but undeniable, their lips met. Slow, surprised, a question and an answer wrapped into one. The kiss held the weight of their pasts, the uncertainty of their futures, and the fragile promise of something new. When they finally parted, the boulangerie hummed around them once more, but inside, Sophie and Julien were suspended in a moment that neither wanted to end. The quiet that followed the kiss was not the soft silence of shared understanding, but a thick, uneasy stillness that settled over Sophie's world like heavy fog. The warm, flour-dusted air of the boulangerie seemed distant now, replaced by an unfamiliar weight pressing on her chest, a swirl of emotions she wasn't ready to untangle. She told herself she needed space, a moment to breathe, to make sense of what had shifted between her and Julien. Thursday came and went without her presence at the boulangerie's familiar window. Julien didn't call or message, respect mingling with his own confusion and hesitation. Eloise noticed Sophie's absence sharply, her brow knitting in worry. "Papa, why isn't Sophie coming?" "Did I do something wrong?" the girl asked one evening, voice small and uncertain. Julien knelt to meet her gaze, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Sometimes people need time," he said softly. "But we'll see her again soon." Meanwhile, Sophie found herself standing before the door of her old apartment, keys cold and unfamiliar in her hand. The hallway smelled faintly of stale air and memories, the cracked paint whispering stories she had tried to forget. Inside, the bare walls stretched wide and hollow, but this time, instead of retreating, she let herself step fully into the space that once felt like a cage. She sank onto the worn wooden floor, the silence wrapping around her like a shroud. And then, without warning, the dam broke. Tears fell freely, no longer tears of pain and regret, but of release and surrender. The weight she had carried so long began to lift, and for the first time in months, Sophie cried for herself. Back at the boulangerie, Julien found the children's art book Sophie had left behind resting on a shelf near the register. He picked it up gently, fingers tracing the colorful illustrations. As he flipped through the pages, a small folded note slipped out and fluttered to the floor. Unfolding it carefully, Julien read her neat, careful handwriting. "For new beginnings, and for the courage to open our hearts again." The words settled over him like a quiet promise. That evening, as twilight deepened and the city's lights blinked awake one by one, Julien stood before Sophie's door. In his hands a bouquet of soft peonies, delicate, hopeful, and fragrant, waiting to bridge the distance. His breath hitched as he raised the flowers, the petals trembling with the fragile promise of what cracks reveal, that beneath the brokenness, something beautiful can bloom. The evening air was cool and still, carrying the faint scents of rain-soaked pavement and blossoming jasmine. Sophie stood just outside her apartment building, the soft glow of the street lamp casting gentle light across her thoughtful face. In front of her, Julien held the bouquet of peonies with a quiet reverence, the petals slightly damp from a passing drizzle. Neither spoke at first, no grand declarations or promises hung between them, only the gentle rhythm of shared breaths and the quiet truth of two souls reaching out after long silence. "I'm glad you came," Sophie said finally, her voice steady but warm. Julien smiled, a tenderness flickering in his eyes. "I'm glad you stayed." She reached out and took his hand, the simple touch grounding them both. "Come in," she invited softly. Inside, the apartment welcomed them, not as an echo of the past, but as a space where new stories could be written. The city lights twinkled beyond the window, but tonight Sophie felt anchored here, in this moment. Weeks later, the boulangerie buzzed with its usual lively hum, but now Sophie moved behind the counter with a quiet confidence, helping Julien part-time. Flour dusted her sleeves, and laughter often bubbled between them, light and unburdened. Eloise, sitting at a small table by the window, sketched furiously, sharing her drawings and stories with Sophie after school. Gone were the silent tears by the window, replaced now by gentle smiles and the steady warmth of belonging. A regular customer, noticing their easy closeness, leaned over to Julien one morning. "Is that your wife?" he asked with a knowing grin. Julien simply smiled, a soft, secret smile that said everything without a single word. Later, Sophie stood by the window, watching the rain fall softly over Paris. This time, the tears were not of sorrow, but of quiet joy, the rain a gentle lullaby cradling a heart no longer afraid to love. If this story moved you, leave us a comment. Like, subscribe, and come back soon for another quiet tale from the heart of Paris.